Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about an activity in Leicestershire which was once very important regionally and nationally, especially during the two world wars. Even though it was happening quite recently, from about 1870 to 1970, very few traces have survived. Ironstone extraction took place over a substantial part of north-east Leicestershire and into adjoining parts of Lincolnshire. A whole network of standard gauge railway lines were built to take the ore to smelters at Scunthorpe, Rotherham, Corby, and initially, more locally, to Ashfordby Hill, near Melton Mowbray. I first put together a video about all this in summer 2020, but several people contacted me to point out several mistakes, and others passed on information I hadn't been aware of. So this video is very much an improved and extended update. The majority of these ironstone quarries are on the summit of a steep escarpment running from Six Hills towards Belvoir Castle. The ridge looks down into the Vale of Belvoir, most of which is in Nottinghamshire. The steep escarpment is caused by the deposit of comparatively hard ironstone, which resists the natural weathering processes better than the softer mudstones underneath. The blue line on this map is the road which follows the ridge. For about two-thirds of that route, from near Holwell to Belvoir Castle, the road was hemmed in by successive quarries. More details later. But suffice to say that often the only evidence of where the quarries once were is fields that are roughly 6 feet below the level of the road. After the working ceased, the soil was just put back, levelled off, but clearly a few feet lower than it had been before the quarrying. Now, looking into this field at Eton might not look very dramatic, but that's the perspective flattening effect of photography. Look at the way the bottom of the gate on the left-hand side hangs in mid-air. That's the same gate looking back from the field towards the road. The ironstone is also close to the surface beyond the ridge to the southeast of Belvoir Castle. It was extensively quarried in the parishes of Denton, Woolsthorpe and Nipton. Other large quarries were further away at Sproston, Tutton-on-the-Hill and in North Rutland. Now, this coloured contour line map indicates the higher ground created by the ironstone, and these are the locations of the major quarrying operations. This is the geological map of the same area. The sanded coloured strata are, predictably, the ironstone deposits. In places they have been mostly covered by alluvial deposits, shown in pale blue, while in other areas, coloured salmon pink, they have been overlain by what we used to call boulder clays, but are now termed glacial tills. Same stuff, same deposition from the later stages of the ice ages in the last 500,000 years. The ironstone is present under these surface deposits, and to the south and east the overburden is limestone, which of course can also be sold. This map shows a wider area showing how iron deposits extend down into Northamptonshire and Oxfordshire. But the southern deposits are both more sandy and usually have a higher iron content. And indeed there was massive extraction of these sands in the mid-20th century to feed the smelters at Corby. The ironstone comes in a variety of qualities. This is the least useful variety for iron extraction because each of these fossils includes calcium carbonate, makes the ore too alkaline or basic. That's a little hand specimen I picked up about 30-odd years ago at the railway cutting in Twyford when it was still accessible. It's been landscaped since then. The fossils are rather pretty. If you're thinking they're called bivalves, then you're not strictly right. Yes, they do have two halves to the shell, but they're actually a whole different order of shellfish known as brachiopods. This is a brachiopod which has been taken out and cleaned up. In the bottom right photograph you can see a little protrusion at the top, which is where the stalk or pedicule allows the animal to attach itself to the seabed, while the shell itself remains above the loose sediment. As well as the ironstone being used for making iron, it was also used locally as building stone, and very attractive the buildings usually are. But the ironstone tends to weather badly, as you can see from near the chimney on this cottage at Holwell. Well, I said that ironstone quarrying started in the 1870s, but more accurately that was when it resumed. There is evidence of Iron Age ironworking in the immediate north of Goby Marwood village, and when the Romans arrived they went, "Ooh, good, we'll have some of this," So much so that the Roman activity developed into a small town. No doubt they make loads of money from it. The remains of one of the more substantial Roman buildings at Goby Marwood was recovered by archaeologists in the 1950s, but sadly the rest of the Roman remains were just destroyed by the quarrying activities without any record. So we know the town was there, but we effectively know nothing about it. There are parallels with other Roman iron extraction sites nearby, including Thistleton, and that was better recorded by archaeologists. And in fact the foundations of a Roman temple at Thistleton still survive as a crop mark. So, here we are, standing in the middle of what was a fairly substantial Roman small town at Goby Marwood. But everything you're looking at here, and also in this photograph taken from the same place, is the soil that has been put back after the quarrying. This gives you an idea of what that field may have looked like during the quarrying. This is all the heaps of topsoil shovelled to one side to allow access to the Ironstone. Eventually it will be levelled off to allow farming to resume. This shows an Iron Age settlement just to the west of Stamford where it's being excavated in 2014. Most of the rings of pits are the posts and drainage ditches of a large roundhouse. But there's also these hearths, and they're the remains of ironworking bowl furnaces. You can see the intense reddening of the soil around the remains of the last fire. And this is not the sort of heat you need to cook your food. This is serious heat, being generated with good quality charcoal and bellows. Around the 12th century, folks were also extracting iron in a commercially very significant way over at Hallerton. This is quite a well-preserved 12th or 13th century Motte and Bailey castle. The castle isn't for any military or strategic purposes, it's nothing like the right location, but it is what was needed to protect the wealth generated by iron production. Same thing still applied in the 17th century. Rockingham Castle was built specifically to protect the royal forges which were exploiting the Northamptonshire iron deposits. All very splendid, obviously of no great military significance, but sadly it had a short life because the iron ore available in this country isn't as good as the iron ores available overseas, particularly in Sweden. So in the later part of the 17th century we began importing worked iron from Sweden. And then later on, of course, in the mid-19th century, we began to import the iron ore from Scandinavia, and that's the start of the South Wales iron production industry, and so forth. So when did we get back to quarrying ironstone in the English Midlands? Well, it happened more by accident than design. The Midland Railway had the bright idea that the people of Melton Mowbray might want to travel to Nottingham, so they commissioned a surveyor to work out the best route. Now, the route they actually used was further west and is now known as the Old Dolby Test Track, but one of the routes being considered went via Holwell, and the surveyor noted ironstone deposits, and made a business deal with a landowner to open up a quarry. Ore was first extracted at Holwell in 1875, first by taking it almost off the cliffside, and then by quarrying, and before later mining. But mining is never a cheap extraction technique, so activities ceased in 1943. It took all of a 3-mile-long standard-gauge branch line to get the ore from Holwell to sidings at Old Dolby. Now, most of what I'm going to tell you is not my research at all. It's the very, very detailed work of a gentleman called Eric Tonks, who sadly is no longer with us. He was an industrial chemist working in Birmingham, but as a hobby he was interested in all aspects of industrial archaeology, particularly railways and quarrying. This work is even more remarkable because Eric pioneered key aspects of such studies. He put it all together as a series of 9 books. They aren't particularly thick, but they're very detailed. And it's the 9th of those volumes, the one about Leicestershire, published just a couple of years before his death, that I've used as the basis of this video. And if you don't think that's nerdy enough, then Eric was also more or less inventor of car number plate spotting, and he also described jazz records. The rather slight figure on the right is the only known photograph of Eric Tonks. This too is Eric Tonks, a Ruston Hornsby diesel locomotive, so renamed at the Roxby Rail Museum at Cottesmore. Within Eric's books are a great number of sketch maps prepared by Ian Lloyd. This is a simpler one, showing the early phases at Holwell. The railway here is shown as narrow gauge, typically 3 feet, while at the top of that map you can see some dates indicating how the quarry face progressed. Because of the prohibitive cost of reproducing colour in the early 1990s, these maps aren't in colour. So what I've done is take Ian's maps and add some colour. Because all the date information is, well, it's difficult to read on the page, and it's simply not going to come through on the screen. So, broadly as a colour coding, the oldest of the quarries from the last quarter of the 19th century are shown in red. The period from about 1900 through the First World War and to the start of the Second World War, shown as a sandy colour. And the First World War created a very significant demand for iron ore. Demand dropped off considerably in the 1920s and some quarries closed, but the Second World War again required maximum output. These mid-20th century phases I've shown in green. In later maps I also used blue to show 1960s and early 1970s extraction, the very last phases of operations. So the idea is that these tints allow you to get a quick glimpse of the chronological sequence, and you also get some idea of the sheer extent of the quarries. Several operators at the same time, moving across the fields, leasing the land, and then when they've exhausted the iron ore, returning the land to agricultural purposes and relinquishing the lease. At the top of this map, the standard gauge line goes under what is effectively a crossroads, shown here with a purple blob. And that road bridge still survives, a rather exemplary standard of masonry on the parapet. And that's looking down over the wall into the cutting and the former track bed. Nearby is the water tower associated with the former locomotive shed. And, well, before mechanisation, this is how the ironstone was extracted. We're at one of the quarries near Eastwell. The lads at the top are removing the overburden and barrowing it over the trestle bridge with the rather narrow planks to spoil tips behind the camera. The lads below are levering out blocks of ironstone and putting them into the narrow gauge tubs. And that's one of the wheelbarrows, in this case a metal one, that survived into preservation at Rocks by Rail. These trestle bridges could be absolutely intimidating. Here we are at Sproston in the 1930s. However, as we can see in the background, the overburden is now being extracted mechanically. Now bear in mind they didn't just use these trestle bridges on nice sunny days. You also use them in strong winds and wet weather. And clearly if you got things a bit sideways, you didn't get a second chance to put it right. And we know that accidents did happen. In the Grantham Journal of the 28th of July 1888 is this report. A serious accident occurred at Holwell this week to Mr. Charles Richardson. Rain having fallen during the night, the planks the men have to wheel the ironstone across were exceedingly slippery, and Richardson was wheeling his empty barrow over. He slipped and fell on the line below, the barrow falling across him. Had the barrow been full, his injuries would have been more serious. As it was, he was badly hurt. Under the careful attention of Dr. Swain, however, he is progressing as favourably as can be expected. It may be remembered that a similar accident occurred to a son of Mr. Richardson at the same works a few months ago. Well, here we are back at Holwell in the fairly early stages of operation with just, well, a horse-drawn cart to take the iron ore away. I think this photograph is from the late 1870s. Quarrying continued until about 1930. And then for about 12 years tunnels were sunk into the side of the quarry face. That's how the quarry shown in the 1870s photograph has survived. It's become a nature reserve. And this is the entrance to one of the tunnels around 1932, soon after it was constructed. The tunnelling ceased in 1943. Tunnels haven't been backfilled, though they are very safely secured with metal grills. A very significant population of bats overwinter in there. That's the quality of the ore from Brown Hills Quarries in Holwell. Very few fossils, so I presume it's good quality stuff. To get the narrow gauge tubs of iron ore from the quarries to the standard gauge loading dock, there was this. I was going to say a cable operated incline, but it's not, it's chains. The operation is delightfully simple and requires no additional power. The loaded tub or tubs are connected to one chain. At the bottom of the hill, one or more empty tubs are connected to the other chain. The two drums have connected together. The chain is wound onto the drums such that one chain goes clockwise and the other one anti-clockwise. And the weight of the ironstone in the loaded tubs is sufficient to bring the empty ones back to the top of the hill. On the level part just above the drums, a little assistance is needed. For a long time horses were used, but by the time this photograph was taken in 1935, a little Ruston locomotive had been acquired. There were several other cable or chain operated inclines. Any evidence of the one to the northwest of Eastwell has been removed by the landowner. But the one taking wagons from Stonepit's farm near Wartnaby survives at least in part, although it's the part leading to the top of the incline which has survived best. This is an almost level section of track bed. It was operated by locomotives. It's the incline section is the part running northwest towards Old Dolby Sidings. The level track bed from the quarry to the head of the incline included a shallow embankment and a bridge over Green Lane. The bridge is gone, and the dip in the road that must have been needed to get under what would have been a very low bridge has been filled in, seemingly using part of the western side of the embankment. But a public footpath running parallel to the embankment on the south side allows the route to be inspected, although the undergrowth makes it tricky to see during the summer months. After the end of the Second World War, Army surplus lorries were brought into use at the quarries, and during the 1950s manufacturers designed ever more powerful and robust trucks. The use of narrow gauge railways ceased, although the trucks of course still emptied into the standard gauge railway wagons. In the 20th century, most of the iron ore from north-east Leicestershire went to Scunthorpe, with some to Rotherham and Corby. But the Holwell Iron Company preceded those developments. Those entrepreneurs who started the quarry at Holwell in the 1870s built their own blast furnaces just to the west of Melton Mowbray at a place called Asverby Hill, but they called it the Holwell Works. Now, the Holwell Works ended up with rather complicated ownership during the middle of the 20th century. In 1960 it was acquired by the Staveley Iron and Chemical Company, who had already taken over Stewart's and Lloyd's. Staveley subsequently merged with the Ilkeston-based Stanton Iron Works, and the resulting company was called Stanton and Staveley. They not only produced ingots of iron at the Holwell Works, they also worked the iron, especially producing cast iron products. And that process still continues in a big way on part of the Holwell Works site. It's now part of the Saint-Gobain operations, and if you see a cast iron manhole cover or roadside drain gully in Britain, then there's a good chance you're seeing something manufactured at Asverby. I took this photograph in September 1986. It shows what remained then of the partly dismantled blast furnaces. I know that smelting commenced at Asverby in 1881, but I haven't been able to find out exactly when the smelting stopped, but I think it was the late 1970s. That's what the site looks like in recent years. This photograph was taken in November 2016. The cast iron activities are just out of shot to the right of this view. It looks very abandoned and derelict, possibly ripe for development, but it has become a triple SI for some of the plants and so forth, including orchids, and to me it seems a remarkable turnaround. Holwell sort of set a fashion. Soon other folks were looking to see if they had ironstone on their land. 2 years later, quarrying started a few miles along the road away at Wartnaby, and like Holwell it struggled after the First World War period, and it actually closed in 1929 as the Great Depression further reduced demand for raw materials such as iron. Again, you can see a network of narrow gauge railway lines, although not all were operating at the same time, connecting the quarries to the cable incline, which dropped down to Old Dolby Sidings. You can just see to the left of the quarries a place called Stonepit House, and that's Stonepit Farm as it is now. The premises have been developed by the family into suppliers of timber products, especially fencing, in a big way. But the Stone Pit's name does suggest that there was some quarrying for building stone predating the more extensive iron ore extraction. In recent years, the owners needed to extend the yard area to accommodate more stock, so they extracted more ironstone, which has indeed been sold for building restoration works. Grateful thanks to one of the members of staff there for giving me a guided tour back in 2019. And this photograph taken in 2019 shows stone exposed, well, I think it's probably 2 or 3 years previously. That's the quality of the stone. Not bad at all, I'd have said. This is Stone Pit's house quarry in operation. The photograph isn't dated. The working practices shown started in the late 19th century and continue to the 1930s. Best guess is that it was probably taken during the peak of production during the First World War. As with the previous shot, the lads at the top are removing the overburden and barrowing it over those planks to the already quarried area on the left, and the lads underneath, again levering the ore out and loading it into the narrow gauge tubs. Moving even further eastwards along that ridge, we get to Eastwell. It's no longer easy to get the ore to the Midland Railway line, but the Duke of Rutland, who owned most of the land around Eastwell, would not allow the Midland Railway to operate, and he would only give permission to the Great Northern Railway. So, in the event, in the 1870s, a Great Northern Railway and the LNER joint line was constructed through the Vale of Belvoir, starting at Saxondale to the west of Bingham and making its way over to Melton Mowbray. Parts still survive. This is the former trackbed at Holwell, looking at the bridge taking the road over the cutting, and plenty of other bridges also survive, although some of them have been filled in underneath. This is the embankment just to the north of Melton Mowbray. It's now part of Melton Mowbray Country Park, so it's easy to get to. Just to the south of Scorford is a footpath which runs along the eastern side of the former trackbed, and several farm access bridges still survive. The severe cracks on this bridge suggest that perhaps not for much longer. And this is how Eastwell was extracted, and this continues later into the 1960s. Again, there's another incline. This one does seem to be rope operated. The track runs straight down into the hazy middle distance. A whole series of wagons were in motion at any one time. They're just clipped onto the cables, not a permanent connection, but obviously it's good enough. And that's the line of that cable incline. Another shot showing the unloading end. On the left is the massive pulley which allows the cable to reverse itself. And top right you might be able to make out the winding house on the horizon in a gap between the trees. Now, a rather ramshackle track, but presumably good enough for the job. That's the winding house. It was there to provide braking to stop the wagons running away. Look at that. I mean, there's a huge number of tubs at the top of that Eastwell incline, and that's the winding house seen from the other direction. Now, this is the Eastwell quarries, so called, but they're actually to the south of the neighbouring village of Eaton and across to Branston. But they're still called the Eastwell quarries because they were operated by the companies who set up the earlier Eastwell extraction. So here we are in the 1950s, probably around 1957. This is how to remove overburden without wheelbarrows and trestle plank bridges. Two Royston Bucyrus 43 RP diesel-powered excavators are in operation. One as a dragline removing overburden, and the other shoveling the iron ore into standard gauge wagons. These diesel excavators replaced an earlier generation of steam-powered ones. Here's three out of use, photographed in April 1957. Right, here we are. Eaton Quarries, different company, and we're now to the north and northwest of Eaton. Again, just a hive of activity between about 1899 and the last operations about 1956. Almost nothing left on the ground now. To get the wagons across a small stream, which is the upper reaches of the River Devon, a rather American-looking trestle bridge was built to the southwest of Eaton village. After a number of years it was beginning to fail, so they simply used the slag from Holwell Works to replace it with an embankment and culvert. That's the watercourse. All that effort just to get trains across something that a human can jump over. That's the embankment as it has survived and overgrown with trees. I've photographed it from the opposite bank to the photograph of the Trestle Bridge. I'm sorry to confuse you. You can see the embankment in the centre of this map. I've already shown you this gateway into a field at Eaton, now about 6 feet below the road because of the Ironstone extraction. And again in Eton, some very attractive buildings constructed from Ironstone in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then it cost an absolute fortune to build an extension, as you see on the left-hand side. Here we are, one of the Eton pits called Beestalls, around 1936. The locomotive is an Avonside 060 saddle tank given the name Adderley. Just about all the locomotives used on these quarry railways were 060s. The connection to the branch line is on the left, and we have the area manager, Mr. Yates, on the right, with straight stem pipe firmly in his mouth. Sorry, I've no idea who the two other people are. Again, steam locomotives gave way to motorised transport in the post-war period. This is a fairly early Muir Hill dump truck operating in 1946. These weren't really big enough, so by 1960 AEC had come up with a dump truck which was a bit more manned for the job. There's also an example of an older AEC Monarch truck in the background. These were all taking ore from the quarry face to the railway sidings. Here we can see something different. Not a rope-operated incline, but a ropeway in the sky. On this map you can see the aerial ropeway running to the left-hand side to Windmill Hill sidings. And as with the cable inclines with wagons on rails, the whole thing operates without any external power. The weight of the ironstone is sufficient to keep things moving and return the empty hoppers back to the top. Very energy efficient. This is the end of the aerial ropeway at Windmill Hill sidings. And you're trying to see two pylon-like structures. Eric Tonks believes it's the only photograph of this ropeway. The cable broke in, we think, May 1948, and then lorries were used until the quarry closed in 1951. Just for comparison, these two photographs show Britain's last aerial ropeway at Claughton in Lancashire, where they're transporting shale for brickmaking. And again, gravity provides all the necessary motion for free. Moving on again towards the village of Nipton, where quarrying continued until about 1955. If you're looking for a landmark, then the most northeasterly of these quarries is getting pretty close to Belvoir Castle. Actually, I say quarrying ceased, but a small quarry face still exists, although stone is only extracted intermittently. I assume it's to allow building restoration on the Belvoir estate. Although near Nipton, they were known as the Waltham quarries. This is the tipping dock for those quarries, seen in July 57. Here we have metre gauge wagons being unloaded into standard gauge wagons. We can reasonably assume that the lady on the left is Eric Tonks' wife, as she does appear in other photographs. And that's on top of that tipping dock, showing one of the metre gauge wagons. This photograph was taken in April 1960. Further over to the east, going through Nipton to Woolsthorpe and Harston and Denton, there are quarries straddling the Leicestershire-Lincolnshire border, and they were operating in principle from 1883 to 1974, but actually were only extensively worked during the two world wars. But, the extraction took place across a huge area. Initially, the stone was conveyed by the Grantham Canal, but the Great Northern came along and built a branch line which was far more efficient. We don't have the date for this photograph, but we're looking at one of the long jib Ruston steam shovels at work in one of the Woolsthorpe quarries. Again, they were using rotary tipplers to get the ironstone into the standard gauge wagons. This photograph taken October 1948, so, strictly no longer Great Northern rolling stock, but British rail wagons. Little doubt exactly the same wagons. To the north, the quarries are at Denton at Harston, and they operated between 1948 and 1972. They did things a bit different there. There was so little overburden that the standard gauge wagons were loaded directly, and rather unusually, the track ran at the lip, or the top, of the quarry face. This photograph shows those standard gauge wagons being shunted by an Andrew Barclay 060 in August 1964. This locomotive was named Beaver, and it's now in preservation at Rocks by Rail. And the loco shed in the background of this photo was also moved to Rocks by Rail and is now in use as the museum's main workshop. Now, in the years leading up to about 1973, no less than 15% of all British Rail's freight traffic was ironstone from the southwest of Grantham being taken to Scunthorpe. Monday to Friday, there were 12 trains a day, another 7 on Saturdays. They made up a total of nearly 57,000 tonnes a week, and the crews operating these trains were all based at Grantham. Now, I happened to live in Barrowby for just over a year, and I discovered that if Scunthorpe hadn't cancelled the contracts with the UK quarries in 1973, then the next workings to be operated up would have been close to where I was living. They'd built an access road for the lorries, and some of this still survives as farm tracks. They even had to build a concrete bridge over the Grantham Canal. However, of course, this wasn't needed, and it was actually demolished just 10 years later, when the plans for all this quarrying were just abandoned. Apart from the almost continuous area from Holwell to the outskirts of Grantham, there were several other places in Leicestershire where ironstone was quarried. The quarry at Sproston was opened up in 1921, although no ore was shipped until 1925. All this ore went to Park Gate at Rotherham, using the Great Northern Railway. No surprise there, the quarry was owned and set up by Park Gate. Quite a complicated arrangements of sidings existed, along with 2 separate narrow gauge railways, although in later years again lorries were used to get the ironstone from the quarry face to the standard gauge wagons. You've seen this photo before, just a reminder of 1930s health and safety at Sproston Quarry. But things did improve. This photograph was taken in April 1960. We're looking at a 43 RB dragline, removing in this case about 15 feet of limestone, the overburden above the ironstone, and loading it into lorries. Clearly the limestone had a commercial value too. One of the biggest of the stripping shovels was powered by electricity. It's a Ransomes and Napier 5360, and it's seen here in March 1962, just popping across the road to relocate to a different quarry. Sproston Quarries operated 060s made by Hudswell Clark. This marshalling activity was photographed in May 1962. Production ceased at Sproston in April 1973, perhaps because Park Gate, like Scunthorpe, began using imported ores. Now, going back to the construction of that joint line near Melton Mowbray, this required a cutting at Tilton on the Hill. That's the cutting, and you can see the rather blocky ironstone quite prominent in the cutting sides. Now, this fairly thick deposit of ironstone extends around the cutting, so they established a quarry around there. And as with the Eastwell quarries, served by the same joint line, the Tilton quarries commenced about 1881 and continued until 1961. Now, at Tilton, the production seems to have ceased because of lack of demand, not because the stone was exhausted. That's the cutting shown here with a purple tint. To the northwest was Marefield Junction, which connected the quarry line to the main Midland Railway operations. This map from 1958 gives an idea of the extent of the quarries at that time. And right down at the south of Leicestershire, almost on the border with Northamptonshire, which was a small quarry which only operated for about 10 out of 14 years, initially between 1861 and 1868. Yet, ironically, more has survived there than at many of the other, much bigger operations. It's in the parish of Neville Holt. It's about halfway along the Melbourne to Drayton Road. On this modern OS map, we can see the county boundary as a wiggly dashed line with blue denoting the River Welland. What we can spot is that the boundary was created when the Welland followed a more convoluted route. The initial plans of the owner at Neville Holt were quite ambitious. As with the Holwell and Holwell Works blast furnaces built over a decade later, at Neville Holt they were expecting big things. Foundations of 4 blast furnaces were constructed, although the furnaces themselves were never built. Ore extraction stopped in 1868, but resumed again in 1871. By then they'd built a cable-operated incline down London North Western Railway to Market Harbour to Peterborough line. But this was short-lived. Quarrying ceased for good in 1874. What has survived well is the route of that incline. This is an undated photograph, but as it was published in Eric Tonks' 1992 book, it has to be earlier than that, possibly by a couple of decades. This photograph was taken in 2020, It's not quite the same angle of view because the farm buildings in the colour photograph are roughly where the white cattle are in the older photograph. Just beyond the copse of trees on the skyline is the old quarry. On the left, in the middle distance, is a prominent spoil heap. Now, the landowner very kindly gave permission for myself and a friend to wander about, so you can see the same spoil heap from a different direction. Extensive quarrying also took part in the northern half of Rutland, notably at Thistleton, Market Overton and Exton Park. Eric Tonks devotes a whole separate book to these, and I've yet to visit them for surviving evidence. So, if you're lucky, one day I'll put together another video about the Rutland quarries. I've already noted that the Second World War was the peak of demand for iron ore. By 1958 there was a depression in the iron smelting industry, and nearly all the quarries suffered short-time working or even periods of closure. The availability of higher quality imported ores led to British blast furnaces being converted to work with these more commercially viable raw materials, and Scunthorpe began using Scandinavian iron ore about 1973. Only Corby kept going, using the Northamptonshire Ironstone in a big way. Its Sundew W1400 dragline was removing overburden in massive amounts. This photograph was taken before 1969, and at that time it was the largest walking dragline in the world. The jib reach was 86 metres, and the bucket capacity 27 tonnes. It could dig and drop at the rate of once a minute, and could move its own weight, near 1,700 tonnes, in under an hour. You can see two diesel-operated shovels extracting and loading the hopper wagons, and there's a seemingly diminutive locomotive is still steam-operated. Eric Tonks provides some figures for the last phases of iron ore production in England. So Northamptonshire was producing 6.5 million tonnes a year, and down in Oxfordshire, around Banbury, they were producing just under a third of a million tonnes, while Leicestershire and South Lincolnshire together came to just under 250,000 tonnes. One of the last quarries operating was near Harston, straddling the Leicestershire-Lincolnshire boundary. Extraction had started in 1889 and it was to end in 1972. A row of workers' cottages still survive. Nearby is a bridge taking Souston Lane over the former railway track bed, and the so-called map room, the offices for the quarry manager, are still standing. These photographs were taken in spring 2022, just before the map room was sold at auction, so presumably it's going to be rebuilt as some sort of posh house. Where was the last quarry operating? Had to be somewhere. It was just inside Lincolnshire at Woolsthorpe, but known as Denton Park. Here we are, further to the north along Souston Lane, looking at one of the fields that was a former quarry. The ground surface is just a few feet lower than the road. Eric Tonks and other enthusiasts turned up on the last day of operations on the 14th of February 1974. Eric is on the right. The Sentinel locomotive that you see in that photograph went into preservation at Rocks by Rail. There it is, and it had acquired the name Betty at some point. If you want to know what's going on under the bonnet of one of those 1960s Sentinels, then this photograph of a different locomotive of the same class gives some idea. No doubt an impressive low-revving diesel engine. Rocks by Rail is a wonderful little museum devoted entirely to the history of ironstone extraction in the immediate region, but it's not open every day, so check out their website before planning a visit. There's some other surviving evidence of ironstone quarrying activities. This Ruston Bucyrus 52B excavator is in preservation at Abbey Pumping Station on the north side of Leicester. It was built in 1935 and it's one of the last of this type of excavator built in Britain. It weighs 81 tonnes and lifts 18 tonnes with its bucket. It operated in Oxfordshire until 1967. In the foreground is one of those small Ruston Hornsby locomotives. And the Eastwell History Group have recently restored the 3-foot gauge Hudswell Clark 040 called Lord Granby. Now, almost none of this video would have been possible without the very detailed research of Eric Tonks, I haven't even begun to summarise his work on the railway locomotives and rolling stock and the more detailed aspects of the quarry's history. But hopefully you found this a useful introduction to his research.